Chris Fixer today with former Alabama Congressman Mo Brooks, who leaves insights on the upcoming election. Mo, how are you, sir?
I'm doing well. Just getting some construction work done. How about you?
Okay. I'm great, sir. Still enjoying retirement?
Oh, absolutely. It's a much better lifestyle for my family and myself.
Great. Glad to hear that, sir. I won't keep much of your time. I just wanted to get your insights on some things. Congressman, how do you see this upcoming election unfolding at
It
this
all
point?
comes down to jury verdicts. The Democrats had a political strategy to do two things. One, indict Donald Trump in order to prompt Republican voters to rally around the flag, so to speak, defend Donald Trump, vote for him, and make him the Republican nominee. So the Democrats want Donald Trump to be the Republican nominee. The second prong of the Democrat Party's two pronged strategy is to obtain a conviction of Donald Trump after he has become the Republican nominee, thereby putting the Republicans in an untenable position of having a presidential nominee who's a convicted felon. So it looks like the Democrats are successful with the first prong of their strategy, indicting Donald Trump, causing the rally around the flag effect, Donald Trump becoming the Republican nominee. The question is going to be whether the second prong of the Democratic Party strategy, obtaining a felony conviction in either Atlanta, Florida, Washington, D.C., or New York, will bear fruit. So it's really coming down to jury verdicts. If Donald Trump is a convicted felon, all of the polling data strongly suggests that Donald Trump and Republicans will lose in a landslide. On the other hand, if Donald Trump is acquitted in all four jurisdictions, that confirms Donald Trump's argument that he's being politically persecuted, which in turn creates a backlash among voters. And the Republicans ought to do extraordinarily well in November, including with the election of Donald Trump back to the White House. So it all comes down to four jury verdicts, and we'll see what happens.
Let me ask you this: you being a attorney, do you think, with Donald Trump being a man that you either love or hate, do you think it's possible to get 12 people on this jury that could reach a unanimous decision?
Well, that is certainly a possibility of there being a hung jury. I don't know how that will play out. The evidence in the law favor a conviction the most in the state of Florida. That's where Donald Trump's defense is the weakest. Quite clearly, he took classified documents, some of which related to Department of Defense matters. Quite clearly, that is a violation of the law. But you've got a federal court judge who is, or appears to be, a Donald Trump loyalist, and you're most apt to get Republicans on a jury who just don't like the smell of it all, who will not convict no matter what. And so, in that circumstance, Donald Trump is apt to have a favorable judge and a favorable jury and be able to obtain an acquittal or a hung jury in the face of the most damning evidence and the worst applicable law. On the other hand, you get into Atlanta, Washington, or New York, the evidence does not seem to be as strong in any of those jurisdictions, but you have jury pools that are going to be much more likely to be dominated by Democrats, and you've got Democrat judges, or at least what appear to be Democrat judges. And so while Donald Trump may have a better evidentiary case and a more favorable legal setting, applicable law in those three jurisdictions, he faces judges and juries that are least likely to acquit him. So in those circumstances, if you get one or two or three Republicans on those three juries, they might choose to stick together and insist on an acquittal if the other jurors, for political reasons or legal reasons, insist on convictions, then you've got hung juries in those three. So hung juries are a possibility in all four jurisdictions, albeit for different reasons.
So if he gets the nomination and then gets convicted, what would happen then? Would the Democratic committee get together and pick a new candidate?
You mean the Republican?
I'm sorry, yes, the Republicans. How would they go about getting a new candidate?
Well, the Republicans, if Donald Trump becomes a convicted felon, are between a rock and a hard place. Ideally, if Donald Trump is a convicted felon, he would do what's best for the country and he would withdraw from the race. But that's very much in conflict with Donald Trump's character and past record. So Donald Trump, he's the kind of guy that will take everybody down on a sinking ship. So I would anticipate that the Republican Party will be between that proverbial rock and a hard place, and they can remove Donald Trump as the Republican Party presidential nominee and replace him with somebody else. But if Donald Trump is going to pitch a fit, if he's going to do like he did in Georgia after Donald Trump lost the presidential election, you may recall in Georgia, his team was encouraging Republican voters not to vote in those Senate runoffs. Well, that cost us the United States Senate. Okay. So Donald Trump takes the same approach. Again, this is assuming that he's a convicted felon. If he takes the same approach where if he's going down, everybody else is going down with him, well, the Republican Party has no good option. Basically, the Republican Party is going to get beat like a drum in November if Donald Trump is a convicted felon, with the only exception being that Donald Trump voluntarily withdraws and then the Republican Party nominates a good candidate, with Donald Trump supporting that good candidate against whomever the Democrats may nominate. So you've got two or three different possibilities there on how the Republican Party could handle it or how it may play out. And I have no clue as to what they will do, because there's no easy answer other than Donald Trump voluntarily withdrawing. But that is the least likely thing that Donald Trump would do.
Who do you think in that case the Republicans would turn to? Nikki Haley or Senator Scott? Governor Santoris, or excuse me, DeSantis.
That's a very good question. DeSantis and Nikki Haley have been fighting for second place from the get-go. And I think they started to see the handwriting on the wall about a year ago. Once these indictments started coming down against Donald Trump, and Donald Trump advanced the argument that he was being politically persecuted, Republican voters rallied for Donald Trump and against the Democrats because of the perception that the Democrats were engaged in unfair and inappropriate, unjust political tactics. Some call it lawfare. And Nikki Haley and Ron DeSantis and the others, in my judgment, were staying in the race in hopes that they would position themselves as the go-to candidate if Donald Trump is convicted and if the Republican Party has to replace Donald Trump as the Republican nominee for president. So if you want someone who is strong, is a conservative, and has a great track record, well, that would be Ron DeSantis. The establishment wing of the party, the money wing of the party, the less principled wing of the party probably would be pushing Nikki Haley. And then when the conviction comes down is important too. If it comes down before the Republican National Convention, then you could have a hellacious floor fight on who the Republican nominee is going to be. On the other hand, and this is what the Democrats prefer, on the other hand, if the Democrats are able to procure that conviction of Donald Trump, say in September, after the Republican National Convention, then it would be up to the National Republican Party to determine whether to remove Trump as the Republican nominee and replace him with someone who's not a convicted felon. Now, who in the Republican Party would be eligible to do that? Well, for sure, you'd have the chair of the Republican National Committee who would participate and have some influence to varying degrees. Then you probably would have 100 or so Republican National Committee men and committee women. There are two from each state I don't know what the allocation is for American territories like Puerto Rico, Guam, the Marianas, and so forth. And then you might have each state's Republican Party chairman participating in this process. Or I don't think this would happen because the logistics are so difficult, or they might reconvene the national convention that was held in either July or August and bring all those folks back in. But most likely it'd be the Republican National Party and its leadership, which means somewhere between 100 and about 175 people would make the decision on behalf of the Republican Party whether Donald Trump is still a viable candidate, or if he has been convicted of a felony, he must be removed so that the Republican Party does not lose in a landslide in November.
Couple more questions for you. You mentioned your retirement. Do you feel like the weapon or the judicial system has been used as a weapon against President Trump?
Well, there are indications yes and indications no. I think the jury verdicts, what happens on appeal, will end up telling us whether there was a legitimate basis for the indictment of Donald Trump. And if he's convicted, well, obviously, there was a legitimate basis for indicting him. But if Donald Trump is acquitted on all of them, then no question, the Democrats improperly used our judicial system against the frontrunner of the Republican Party for the nomination to the presidency of the United States.
Do you feel this right here could create a pattern of vicious, a pattern where this open Pandora's box? Okay, you went after him. The next Republicans, they're going to go after Democrats until we just have never-ending cycles of trying to use the judicial system against whoever's in the policy against whoever's in office.
Well, here's the thing. It seems, and this is my impression, that there are a lot more instances in which the Democrats use the judicial system to prosecute Republicans than Republicans use the judicial system to prosecute Democrats. So it's not a totally one-way street, but it sure does seem like one direction has about 5 lanes and the other direction has 1. And the Democrats, quite clearly, in my judgment, use the judicial system to persecute or prosecute Republicans far more often than the Republicans use the judicial system to prosecute Democrats. There are probably a lot of different reasons why that appears to be the case, but I'm not in that decision-making process, and you'd have to ask some of those folks who are engaged in wrongfully prosecuting Republicans, or on the Republican side, declining to prosecute equally culpable Democrats. Hillary Clinton would be a real good example, just by way of history. I mean, gosh, she engaged in unlawful conduct that, if it had occurred on, say, Redstone Arsenal in the Tennessee Valley, would have resulted in prosecutions and the quick termination of whichever employee engaged in that kind of conduct. Putting that kind of information on a computer system outside of the security measures employed by the United States government to protect our classified, most highly sensitive information. But the Republicans under Donald Trump, for whatever reason, chose not to prosecute Hillary Clinton, although she was quite clearly guilty of a criminal offense.
Very much so. One last one here. President Trump is convicted, removed from the ballot, or whatever. Do you think there will be a backlash of people that would vote against the Democrats for that reason?
Not if they have faith that the conviction was appropriate. To the contrary, I think there'd be a backlash against Republicans for keeping as their nominee a convicted felon.
Interesting.
So it really depends on the circumstances. I mean, I never thought in my lifetime that either party would have as its nominee for president a convicted felon. But there is that risk this go around. There is no question but a risk that in one of these 4 cases, Donald Trump's going to be a convicted felon. I don't know which one. I don't know how many felonies of the 91 that he might be convicted of, but the Republican Party may persist in keeping Donald Trump as their Republican nominee, despite Donald Trump being a convicted felon. Now, for emphasis, juries will determine whether Donald Trump is guilty of a felony. And, all of this is a high stakes game played by the Democratic Party. It's two prongs. The first prong, indicting Donald Trump, causing Donald Trump's indictment to have that rallying around the flag effect, and causing in turn Donald Trump to be the Republican nominee. The Democrats have played that card, that strategy out to perfection. Now we're getting to the part as to whether or not those indictments will result in convictions. And just as if Donald Trump is convicted of a felony, in my judgment, the Democrats win handily in November. If Donald Trump is not convicted, then there will be a lot of American citizens who will vote against the Democrats because they believe that the failure to obtain a conviction is compelling evidence that the Democrats have wrongfully persecuted Donald Trump for purely political reasons. And I believe that backlash will result in a very favorable November for Republicans. So it's high stakes. These jury verdicts, in my humble opinion, are going to determine who the next president of the United States is.
Let me ask you one final question. What do you think that the wild card of Robert Kennedy Jr. is in this campaign? Because I've seen him right now leading with, and I know it's not a big demographic, but it could be something to shift the race in a close state, that he is leading right now in first place between 18 to 34-year-old voters.
Well, again, it depends on these jury verdicts.
Okay.
And it also depends on whether the Democrats persist in keeping Joe Biden as their nominee. I still have a belief that there is a strong possibility that the Democrats are not going to have Joe Biden as their nominee, that between now and the Democratic National Convention, Joe Biden is going to resign, or the Democrats are going to determine that he is mentally incapable of performing his duties as president of the United States, and they're going to get somebody else. So the question then is going to become, who is that somebody else? But if, worst case scenario, the Democrats persist in nominating Joe Biden, even though he's mentally incompetent, and he is the Democrat nominee in November, with every indication that his mental capacity is going to continue to deteriorate, and the Republicans discover that they have a convicted felon as their nominee, keeping in mind that both of these gentlemen are either in their 80s or close to their 80s, with Joe Biden already clearly having diminished mental capacity, and Donald Trump, if you've been noticing the way he's conducting himself, his mental acumen today is not what it was in 2016. It has declined. Now, how much it has declined is up for debate, but there is no debate about whether it has declined. He's making mental mistakes that he didn't make in 2016, like when he doesn't know the difference between Nancy Pelosi and Nikki Haley. That's a pretty egregious error. If his mind if his mind continues to deteriorate, as is almost always the case with people who are of that age, and those two, Biden mentally unable to do the job, plus probably the head of a family crime syndicate, based on the evidence that's come out with how much their family has profited from improper use of White House influence, improper use perhaps of the days in which Joe Biden was in the United States Senate on the one hand, and then Donald Trump being a convicted felon and also having diminished capacity on the other hand, then the prospects of a third party candidate getting a lot of votes increases dramatically. So that's one scenario. If, on the other hand, the Democrats decide to not have Joe Biden as their nominee, they get someone who's mentally capable to do the job, who's presentable. And if Donald Trump is convicted and the Republicans are able to get a solid replacement as their nominee, well, then the vote count of a third party candidate is going to be a whole lot less. And then there's going to be all sorts of possibilities in between, not very much for a third party candidate and a whole lot, depending on how many different variable factors play out.
Okay. And this final one, I may have asked this already. I can't remember. Do you think that Gavin Newsom will be the person they turn to?
I don't know. Michelle Obama is probably their strongest candidate. She's female, she's African American, and those are two hot buttons that would cause a lot of people to go to the polls who otherwise might not. People who vote based on chromosomes, or people who vote solely based on skin pigmentation. But in any event, she'd be a strong candidate. So
I was on a radio show earlier this morning. Somebody asked me that, and I agree with you. I said the same thing, that I would be very, nervous if that was the Democratic candidate, if I was Republicans.
But if it's Gavin Newsom, I would prefer Gavin Newsom over Michelle Obama, because Gavin has a track record. Michelle Obama does not have a public policy track record. So that means the Democrats could market her as just about anything that is consistent with what the polling says the voters want to hear. Gavin Newsom would have a more difficult time marketing himself as anything that is consistent with what the voters want to hear, because he's got a track record in California that quite clearly establishes that Gavin Newsom's public policies are way out of sync with the majority of the American people.
All right, Congressman, I appreciate your time. I'm going to let you get back to enjoying retirement, and thank you for these monthly interviews you've been giving me.
Certainly. Have a blessed day.
You too, sir.